Hotel owner works weddings in bellhop disguise, pretends to test bride's kindness secrets. Ended the moment a bride slapped the bellhop across the face in front of 200 guests. The metal tray he was carrying crashed onto the marble floor, champagne glasses shattering like ice. For a second, the entire ballroom went silent. Then laughter rolled in waves. No one noticed the tiny red recording light blinking above the archway, capturing everything the bellhop was told to erase with a smile. 3 hours earlier, Daniel Kess stood in the service corridor beneath Kess Grand Hotel wearing a wrinkled bellhop uniform that didn't belong to him, adjusting a name badge that read Dan, temp staff, while his wrist flicked once to activate the hidden command in his earpiece, silently switching the ballroom into observation mode. Above him, the same chandeliers that cost more than most guests' weddings were already glowing, and the air smelled like roses, polished wood, and entitlement. On the other side of the corridor door, Brielle's wedding team was rehearsing her entrance like it was a coronation, not a marriage, her voice sharp as she corrected how the bridesmaids should stand less poor in the photos. While a planner nodded quickly, afraid to lose the contract worth millions. Daniel walked past them pushing a cart stacked with bridal luggage, white leather cases marked with gold initials. Each case secretly tagged with a micro-camera sync point connected to the hotel's internal network he alone could access. A junior staff member nearly bumped into him and apologized, but Daniel only lowered his head, letting the role of invisibility do its work, because invisibility was the only truth people ever revealed themselves to. In the control room above, Marcus watched the live feeds flicker across 6 screens and asked quietly if the test boundaries were still active. Daniel didn't answer immediately, instead watching Brielle arrive downstairs through the glass reflection. Perfect dress, perfect smile, perfect performance, and noticing how she didn't look at anyone beneath her eye level unless it was to correct them. When she snapped at a porter for touching her gown, Daniel's fingers tightened once on the cart handle, not in anger, but in confirmation, as if a hypothesis was beginning to prove itself in real time. A bellhop uniform, after all, was not just fabric here. It was a mask that erased identity, and Daniel had chosen it precisely because masks always reveal more than crowns ever do. As he reached the ballroom entrance, the system pinged softly in his ear. All cameras engaged, crowd density optimal, emotional response tracking enabled, and that was when he saw the bride Brielle lift her chin toward the entrance like she was about to judge a stage she believed belonged to her alone. While Daniel stepped forward into the light carrying a tray of glasses, already knowing that somewhere inside this wedding, kindness and cruelty were about to be measured in ways no one in that room understood yet. Daniel moved through the edge of the ballroom like a shadow that had learned how to breathe quietly inside luxury, balancing the tray of glasses while guests laughed and music swelled under crystal chandeliers that reflected a world built on appearances. The system in his earpiece continued to pulse soft data, faces mapped, behavior tagged, emotional spikes recorded, but Daniel's attention shifted when he saw Elise near the side staircase, standing alone for the first time since the ceremony began. Her hands were trembling slightly at her waist, fingers gripping the fabric of her dress as if trying to hold it together through will alone, and he noticed immediately what others would have ignored. A seam along the back zipper had split, slow and dangerous, threatening to tear fully open with every step she took. She didn't call for help. She didn't want attention. She simply turned her body slightly away from the crowd, trying to hide damage in a room designed to expose everything. Daniel paused, the tray tilting just slightly, and for the first time that evening, he stepped outside the role he had chosen. He set the tray down on a passing service table without looking at the server who nearly dropped it in surprise, then walked toward Elise with measured steps that did not match the behavior expected of a bellhop. Elise stiffened. When she saw him approaching, instinctively pulling her dress tighter, her voice low and uncertain when she whispered that she was fine, that she just needed a minute, but Daniel didn't respond with words. He simply turned his body to block the line of sight from the main hall, creating a human shield between her and the ballroom's gaze. "Turn slightly," he said quietly, not as instruction, but as precision, and when she hesitated, he added, "You're about to step into the aisle and the zipper will fully break. I can fix it before it happens." There was a pause where trust and fear collided, and then Elise nodded once. Barely. Daniel knelt. Not dramatically, not for effect, but with controlled urgency, and reached into the small repair kit hidden beneath the service cart he had personally modified before the event. As his fingers worked the fabric, he became aware of movement behind him. A bridesmaid noticing, then whispering, then laughing under her breath as if the bellhop was overstepping his place. Within seconds, Brielle herself appeared at the top of the staircase, her gaze locking onto the scene like a spotlight finding a mistake, her expression tightening as she misread the moment entirely. "What are you doing with my guest?" she snapped, voice sharp enough to cut through music, and Daniel did not turn immediately, finishing the repair with steady hands before rising slowly. Elisa's dress was secured again, but the damage had already shifted perception. Brielle stepped closer, heels striking marble like accusation, and demanded that he stop touching the bridal party, accusing him of sabotaging the event or trying to create distraction for attention. A manager appeared almost instantly, pulled by the escalation, and without waiting for explanation, began checking Daniel's badge as if the answer had already been decided. Daniel's eyes flicked once to the hidden camera node above the archway. Still recording, still active, and for a fraction of a second, his calm expression tightened, not in fear, but in calculation, because helping Elise had triggered something irreversible. The system had flagged him for unauthorized interaction beyond service role. Boundaries. And in the control room above, so Marcus's screen had already turned amber. Daniel exhaled slowly as the manager ordered him to step away from the bridal area, and Brielle's voice followed him like a verdict he hadn't been allowed to answer. But as he turned back toward the service corridor, one question remained suspended in the system log, now blinking in red. Why would a bellhop risk exposure to protect a bride who wasn't even his assignment? In the service corridor beneath Kess Grand Hotel, the amber alert on the internal monitoring system pulsed again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if the building itself had begun to question the man in the bellhop uniform. Daniel stood just outside the bridal wing entrance, his hand still faintly marked by the tension of the zipper repair, while two security staff members spoke in low tones near the door, their voices carrying fragments like unauthorized assistance and behavior deviation from service protocol. Inside the control room above, COO Marcus watched 6 synchronized feeds freeze on Daniel's position, then restabilize as the system recalibrated its classification. "He's interacting beyond assigned guest service boundaries," one technician said, but Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he zoomed into the time-stamped footage from earlier, Elise standing alone, zipper failing, Daniel stepping in. Not because it was unusual for staff to help, but because of the precision in how he moved, as if he had already predicted the failure before it happened. Downstairs, Daniel was quietly escorted away from the ballroom threshold, but as he walked, he noticed something new. The system feed in his earpiece briefly exposed a hidden layer labeled Wedding Integrity Simulation Node, a term that should not have been visible to any bellhop account. He paused for half a second too long, forcing one of the staff members to ask if he was confused, but Daniel only lowered his gaze, storing the anomaly without reacting. Above him, Brielle's wedding planner was now speaking urgently into a phone, insisting that the bellhop be removed permanently, describing him as a disruption risk to guest perception. Flow. A phrase so carefully polished it sounded less like anger and more like strategy. What no one in the ballroom knew was that Daniel's earpiece had already logged that exact phrase into a separate behavioral profiling file tied to Brielle's inner circle. Meanwhile, Elise, now seated near the side aisle, watched Daniel being led away and quietly pressed her fingers against the repaired seam of her dress, unaware that the thread holding it together had been sourced from a specialized repair kit only issued to executive-level staff. The contradiction lingered. Why would a bellhop carry tools designed for high-tier event intervention? In the corridor, Daniel was stopped briefly at a restricted door when a junior manager hesitated, scanning his badge again with growing uncertainty, because the system's classification kept shifting between temporary staff and unknown verified access. A conflict that should not exist in a simple employee profile. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm but precise, asking only one question. Who authorized the wedding simulation layer to run live during guest attendance? The question landed wrong in the corridor, like a sound that did not belong to his role, and the manager stiffened, suddenly unsure whether he was speaking to a bellhop or someone higher trying to sound like one. In the control room, Marcus froze. That layer was not supposed to be visible at all, especially not to field staff. For a moment, the entire system hesitated, as if deciding whether Daniel belonged inside or outside its architecture. And as the ballroom music swelled again behind closed doors, Daniel turned slightly toward the glass reflection of the hall, seeing Brielle laughing with her bridal party, unaware that her wedding was no longer just an event. It was now a monitored behavioral experiment, and he was either its operator or its most dangerous anomaly. The corridor lights outside the bridal wing shifted from warm gold to a colder, controlled white as Daniel was escorted past a door he had never been allowed to open before. A matte black panel marked simply elevation access. Authorized personnel only. 2 security staff walked slightly behind him now, not touching him but no longer pretending he was invisible either. The system in his earpiece flickered again, but this time the anomaly didn't fade. It expanded, mapping new permissions across layers he had never activated. Temporary staff cannot access upper-tier coordination zones, one guard muttered, checking Daniel's badge for the 3rd time, while the scanner repeatedly returned a conflicting result. NO invalidation / NO confirmation / system override pending. Daniel said nothing. He simply followed. The elevator doors opened without a request. That alone changed the air. Inside, the lighting was silent, pressure-controlled, and the mirror walls reflected not a bellhop, but a man whose stillness did not belong to service work. As the elevator ascended, Daniel noticed something embedded in the floor interface. A hidden biometric sensor that had already logged his presence 3 times before he even stepped in. That should not have been possible for someone in his assigned role. When the doors opened again, the world shifted. The sound of the ballroom disappeared completely, replaced by a low hum of servers and glass-walled operations rooms overlooking the entire wedding floor like a surveillance cathedral. This was not guest space. This was control architecture. A woman stood waiting near the exit threshold. Mid-40s, sharp posture, silver ID badge marked Event Governance. Her nameplate read Harper Lane, and she did not smile. "You're not cleared for this level," she said immediately, eyes scanning him like a system rejecting an unknown file. Daniel replied calmly, "Then your system made a mistake letting me in." That made her pause. Not because of disrespect, but because he said it like truth, not defense. Harper stepped aside only slightly, enough to let him pass into the glass observation room where multiple wedding feeds streamed in real time across curved monitors, each labeled not by bride names, but by behavioral profiles. Trust index, compliance risk, social dominance score. Daniel's eyes narrowed just once. "These weren't active when I designed the original hospitality framework," he said quietly, and for the first time Harper's expression changed, subtle but measurable. "You didn't design this," she replied. "You're a bellhop contractor assigned to field observation." Daniel didn't correct her. Instead, he walked closer to the central console, where Elisa's interaction earlier had already been flagged under a red tag labeled Unscheduled Compassion Event. That classification alone was enough to reassign her entire profile weight in the system. "Who approved emotional scoring for wedding guests?" Daniel asked. No one answered immediately, because the answer required authorization above Harper's clearance level. Then a second voice came through the intercom, calm, controlled, and unfamiliar. "Let him run level 1 diagnostics." The room shifted. Harper turned slightly, tense now. "That's not protocol," she said. But the authorization had already overridden her objection. A terminal slid open in front of Daniel, inviting input without asking permission. For a fraction of a second, he hesitated, not because he lacked access, but because he understood what this meant. The system was not testing the brides anymore. It was testing him. And as his fingers hovered above the interface, unaware eyes far below in the ballroom continued laughing, drinking, celebrating a wedding that was quietly becoming something else entirely, while somewhere deeper in the system architecture, a new alert silently flagged his presence under a category that had no name, only a question. Why is the bellhop already inside the control layer? The terminal inside the control layer lit up under Daniel's hands with a soft white pulse, as if the system had been waiting for him longer than it was willing to admit. Harper Lane stood a step behind him, arms crossed, watching every micro-movement like she was trying to decide whether he was an asset or a breach. On the curved glass wall, wedding feeds continued streaming below. Brielle laughing too loudly at a toast. Naomi adjusting her dress for a camera. Elise sitting quietly at the edge of the frame, unnoticed again. But Daniel wasn't watching them anymore. His focus was on the diagnostic layer that had just opened. Level 1 Behavioral Integrity Map. The interface asked no permission, simply exposed. He placed 2 fingers on the console, not typing commands in the traditional sense, but synchronizing with a system he clearly understood too well for someone labeled temporary staff. A set of hidden data streams unfolded instantly: guest interactions, staff decisions, emotional response curves, each one tied to the wedding floor below. Harper leaned closer, her voice lower now. That layer is restricted to executive architects. Even I don't normally have full right access. Daniel didn't look up. Then someone already bypassed your hierarchy, he said calmly. On the screen, Brielle's earlier interaction with Elise, her dismissive glance, the moment she ignored Elise's presence after the zipper repair, had already been scored by the system under dominance normalization behavior. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. This wasn't just surveillance. It was interpretation. He made a small adjustment in the diagnostic map, subtle, almost invisible, and suddenly Elise's profile shifted from low visibility participant to ethical stabilization anomaly. The system paused for half a second, recalculating. Harper noticed immediately. "What did you just do?" she asked, sharper now. Daniel finally turned his head slightly. "I corrected a bias loop." Below them, in the ballroom, Elise was being laughed at again by a group of bridesmaids who misinterpreted her silence as submission. But the system feed now flagged their behavior, not Elise's, as escalating social aggression. For the first time, the camera tracking angle subtly recentered her instead of the crowd. Harper took a step back. "That kind of recalibration triggers executive alerts," she warned. Daniel's fingers hovered again, then executed a second adjustment, this time linking Elise's interaction thread to the integrity scoring model used in vendor selection contracts. A soft alarm chimed somewhere deep in the building network, not loud, but deliberate. On another screen, Brielle's wedding planner noticed a sudden change in system behavior and frowned, tapping her tablet as notifications began stacking without explanation. Unexpected priority shift. Source unknown. Daniel exhaled slowly, pulling his hands away. It wasn't a victory that anyone downstairs could see, but it was a structural shift. Small, precise, irreversible. Harper stared at the data cascade in silence now, her skepticism replaced by something more cautious. "You're not supposed to know how this layer thinks," she said quietly. Daniel replied without looking at her. "Then it's lucky I wasn't trying to learn it for the first time." For a moment, the room held still, until a red pulse expanded across the upper corner of the system interface, deeper than the previous alerts, labeled simply, "External Oversight Initiated." Harper's expression changed instantly. "That's not internal," she said. "That means someone above us just noticed the recalibration." Daniel looked at the screen again, where Elise's image remained quietly highlighted among the chaos below, now subtly elevated in system priority, but also now flagged as source-linked anomaly candidate. Somewhere in the wedding floor beneath them, laughter continued, unaware that the architecture above had just shifted its attention toward a single bellhop who was no longer being evaluated, but was now being watched as the origin of disruption itself. The first sign that something had shifted was not on the ballroom floor, but in the control layer above it, where Daniel's earlier recalibration still pulsed softly across Elise's behavioral profile like a wound that refused to close. Harper Lane was no longer speaking. She stood behind him now with her arms lowered, watching the system logs cascade faster than they should have, each line updating without human input. Then the first alert hit the external feed. Unauthorized narrative leak. Wedding floor. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. That wasn't a technical error. That was language. Real language meant someone outside the system was now shaping perception. Down below, in the ballroom, Brielle was smiling for photos again, But her wedding planner had already shifted tone. Leaning into guests, whispering carefully crafted sentences designed to sound like concern rather than accusation. "We may have an incident with staff misconduct," she said. Softly, just loud enough for the right people to hear, her face calm, rehearsed, almost sympathetic. The kind of expression that made lies feel like protocol. Within minutes, phones were out. Clips were being recorded. The bellhop who had disrupted the ceremony was no longer just a worker. He was now a problem narrative being assembled in real time. Daniel saw it immediately in the data layer. Sentiment tags flipping, guest reactions being reclassified, Elisa's earlier interaction being reframed as staff interference with bridal experience. It was precise, deliberate, coordinated. Harper finally spoke, her voice tight. "This is social engineering. Someone is feeding the system external interpretation loops." Daniel didn't answer at first. He was watching Brielle's planner now moving through the crowd like a conductor, pausing at key tables, planting phrases that would later become quotes. He touched guest property without authorization. He acted outside his assigned role. "We may need to report this formally." Each sentence was small alone. Together, they were architecture. Daniel turned away from the main feed and pulled up the raw interaction logs, the ones still unfiltered by narrative scoring. What he saw there made his expression change for the first time. A duplicated access signature. Someone had cloned his Bellhop ID and used it to trigger secondary system events in restricted zones he had never entered. Harper stepped closer, reading over his shoulder now. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That ID only exists in your assigned layer." Daniel's voice stayed low. "Not anymore." Below, chaos was building in soft layers. Guests arguing, staff unsure, managers receiving conflicting instructions from higher-tier coordinators who were now echoing the planner's version of events. The bellhop was becoming a story before he could become a truth. And then the second hit came. A security alert flashed across Daniel's interface. Property violation claim, bridal assets. Attached was a fabricated clip. Him near Brielle's preparation area, edited just enough to suggest intrusion rather than assistance. The system auto-tagged it as credible escalation risk. Harper's face hardened. "They're trying to remove you from the system entirely," she said. Daniel didn't move. He simply accessed the hidden diagnostic thread he had built earlier, pulling every unmodified frame from Elisa's interaction chain, every timestamped correction, every unedited moment the system hadn't yet overwritten. "If they want a narrative," he said quietly, "they're going to have to compete with time." But even as he spoke, a deeper warning appeared on the upper control panel. This one not from internal staff, not from the wedding floor, but from external governance oversight. Subject Daniel KSS. Behavioral anomaly flagged for review. And for the first time, the system was no longer just watching him. It was preparing to judge him. The notification hit Daniel's interface like a clean surgical cut. Subject removal initiated. Temporary access revoke. For half a second, the entire control layer around him dimmed, as if the building itself had decided he no longer belonged inside its logic. Harper Lane stepped forward instinctively, but even she stopped when her own access badge flickered red for a moment, caught in the same purge sweep. "They're isolating you," she said, voice tighter now, less analytical and more human. Daniel didn't respond immediately. On the main feed below, the ballroom was still alive. Music, laughter, champagne, but the perception of it had already changed. Guests were no longer watching a wedding. They were watching a story being told about a mistake. Brielle stood at the center of it all, her expression carefully composed, while her wedding planner moved through clusters of guests, repeating the same calibrated phrase. "We are handling an internal staff misconduct issue." The phrase spread faster than truth. In the system logs, Daniel saw his identity begin to fracture. One version still labeled Field Integrity Observer, another now stamped Unauthorized Interference Subject. It wasn't confusion. It was design. And then the elevator feed showed it. Security teams moving toward his last known corridor position. Not to question. To remove. Harper turned sharply toward him. "You need to leave this layer before they lock it." Fully. But Daniel was already walking back toward the diagnostic terminal, where Elisa's profile still hovered faintly in the system's ethical layer, now downgraded again after the narrative override. That was the moment he realized something deeper. They weren't just targeting him. They were erasing everything he had corrected. Below, Elise was alone near the side of the ballroom, holding the repaired seam of her dress from earlier as if it had suddenly become fragile again. The kindness he had stabilized in the system was now being statistically reversed in real time, reframed as false positive anomaly behavior. And then the old clue resurfaced, Daniel's earlier level 1 access note, the one that had briefly exposed the wedding simulation layer. He understood it now differently. It was never a monitoring system. It was a control engine trained to rewrite perception based on authority consensus. Harper watched as Daniel pulled the raw, unedited interaction logs from hidden storage, data that had never been visible to the upper governance layer. If you use that, she said carefully, you trigger full escalation. Daniel looked at her for the first time since the purge began. It's already escalated, he said quietly. A new alert flashed across every screen in the room. External override executed. Subject classification finalizing. His Bellhop identity was being overwritten at the source. Security doors in the corridor below sealed one by one with a metallic finality, cutting off exit paths. But Daniel didn't step back. Instead, he connected the raw integrity logs directly into the ballroom projection network, bypassing authorization entirely. Harper's voice broke slightly. You can't win this layer alone. Daniel's answer was calm, almost detached. I'm not trying to win it. And as the system prepared its final judgment stamp over his identity, Daniel initiated a full integrity broadcast override, locking every unedited moment, every interaction, every truth they had tried to rewrite, into a single irreversible transmission path toward the one place no narrative control system could fully suppress: the public floor of the wedding itself. The ballroom, projection screen ignited without warning. Every chandelier reflection, every guest face, every whispered accusation suddenly overwritten by raw system feed footage that no one remembered authorizing. Daniel stood at the edge of the control relay access point, his fingers still connected to the override terminal, while behind him Harper's voice cracked for the first time since the system escalation began. You just forced a full integrity broadcast into live guest projection. Below them, the wedding hall shifted instantly from celebration to confusion as the massive central display flickered, cutting between Brielle's smiling toast and unedited security logs showing her earlier slap. The exact moment her hand struck the bellhop's face, captured in cold, unfiltered resolution. Gasps spread through the room like fire catching oxygen. Brielle froze mid-step, her glass trembling in her hand as she saw herself on screen behaving differently than the narrative her planner had been feeding the guests. Turn that off, the wedding planner snapped at the AV team, panic breaking through her polished tone for the first time. But the system no longer accepted manual override. Daniel didn't speak. He only adjusted one final layer of the integrity chain, and the second feed emerged. The duplicated Bellhop ID, the forged access logs, the edited clip used to accuse him of misconduct. One by one, the fabrications collapsed under timestamp mismatches and biometric inconsistencies that even non-technical guests could now see highlighted in red annotations across the screen. Harper stepped closer, watching the evidence cascade in real time. They cloned your service ID, she said quietly, realization replacing doubt. Daniel nodded once. They didn't just lie. They engineered consensus. Downstairs, Brielle's expression shifted rapidly. From confusion to denial to something sharper. Defensive. This is manipulated, she shouted toward the technicians, pointing at the screen as if volume could override proof. He is just staff. This is sabotage. But the system responded automatically now, pulling archived interaction trails. Elisa's repaired dress, the system recalibration Daniel executed, the behavioral scoring shifts that elevated Elisa's integrity rating. Every claim Brielle made was being cross-checked against immutable logs that Daniel had locked into the broadcast chain. The wedding planner tried to interrupt again, stepping forward with her prepared statement about protecting guest experience. But even her words were now overlaid with conflicting metadata showing prior instructions to Construct perception framing if behavioral anomalies arise. The room began to fracture socially before it fractured structurally. Guests turning to each other, unsure who to believe when both narrative and evidence were now visible at once. Daniel finally moved from the control edge, walking down the elevated access stairs toward the open balcony overlooking the ballroom. His bellhop uniform was still on him, but now it carried no meaning of service, only exposure. "You didn't just misjudge me," he said, his voice carrying through the hall as microphones automatically amplified him. "You built a version of reality where truth depended on status." Brielle turned toward him, anger breaking fully now. "You set this up," she insisted, voice shaking. "You wanted to embarrass me." Daniel stopped at the railing above the ballroom floor, where every guest could see him clearly. "No," he replied. "I let the system show what you already did when you thought no one mattered enough to record you honestly." And then the final proof layer activated, the original integrity feed from Elisa's interaction, unedited, uncompressed, undeniable. The ballroom fell into a silence so complete it felt like sound itself had been removed. Brielle opened her mouth again, but nothing came out this time, because for the first time, the evidence could not be interrupted, reframed, or reversed. It was already everywhere, already seen, already final. The silence inside Kess' grand ballroom did not break. It dissolved, as if the building itself no longer knew how to continue pretending. Daniel stood at the edge of the upper balcony, the same bellhop uniform still on his body, but now it felt like a relic from a version of reality that had already collapsed. Below him, Brielle remained, frozen in place, her face no longer composed, no longer curated, just exposed in a way no mirror or camera filter could repair. The wedding planner tried to speak again, but her voice caught when the guests began checking their own phones, each screen now syncing automatically with the integrity broadcast Daniel had locked into the system, showing timestamps, edits, and the original footage of every moment they had been told to misunderstand. Harper Lane appeared beside Daniel, quieter now, her earlier skepticism replaced by something heavier. "It's over," she said softly, not as a celebration, but as a conclusion the system had finally accepted. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He watched as Brielle stepped forward, her voice trembling as she attempted one last defense. "I didn't know," she said, turning to the crowd instead of him. "I didn't know that was him." But the system had already documented that she had known enough to choose humiliation, enough to choose cruelty when she believed there would be no consequence. The wedding planner was the first to be formally flagged by governance logs, her contract revoked in real time as evidence tied her directly to narrative fabrication protocols. Security staff began moving in, not toward Daniel this time, but toward the planner and the executives who had authorized the false framing sequence. Brielle turned back toward Daniel, her expression breaking now, not in anger but in collapse. "What do you want from me?" she asked, voice barely holding together. And for a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to wait for punishment, for humiliation in return, for the mirror to turn into revenge. Daniel stepped down from the balcony slowly, walking into the center of the space where the original slap had happened, where the bellhop had first been reduced to nothing in front of everyone. He looked at Brielle, then at Elise, who still stood quietly near the side, untouched by the narrative collapse but deeply changed by what had been revealed. "I don't want repayment," Daniel said finally. "I want accountability." Brielle tried to speak again, but stopped when the system projection shifted one last time, showing not just her actions but the ripple effect. Staff reprimanded unfairly, reputations damaged, people dismissed based on a lie that felt true because it was convenient. The weight of it landed differently now. Not dramatic, not theatrical, real. The wedding planner was escorted away without resistance, her protests dissolving into silence as contract enforcement clauses activated against her entire professional record. Brielle remained, but she was no longer defended by structure or illusion. Daniel did not offer forgiveness. Not immediately. Instead, he turned toward Elise and removed the bellhop badge from his uniform for the first time, placing it gently onto the same service tray that had once carried shattered glass in the opening moments of this night. "This system will change," he said quietly, more to the room than to any one person. "Not because I exposed it, because it finally showed what it was built to ignore. He did not return to the role he had worn. And as he walked past the broken symmetry of the wedding hall, past the silence where laughter used to be, he stopped only once, looking at the cracked reflection of the same tray that had fallen at the beginning, now repaired in his hands by someone else, its surface no longer a symbol of service or humiliation, but of truth finally carried without disguise.